For over 6 decades, Sir Cliff Richard has stood tall not just as a singer, but as a living monument to discipline, dignity, and grace. He wasn't simply Britain's first rock star, he was its moral compass, a symbol of unwavering integrity in an industry built on chaos. They called him the British Elvis, but in truth, he was something rarer, a man who soared to fame without scandal, who kept his faith when fame tried to strip it away, who stood still when the world around him demanded he bend. Cliff Richard seemed untouchable, elegant without arrogance, famous without drama. His presence alone offered comfort, a kind of purity the public could rely on. But what if that same purity was also his greatest burden? What if behind that reassuring smile was a man quietly bleeding? What if the silence he maintained, so dignified, so composed, wasn't peace at all, but the cost of never being allowed to break? Behind the poised public figure was someone who endured betrayal, shouldered suspicion, and survived heartbreaks the world never saw coming. A man who, after giving joy to millions, would one day find himself utterly alone in the cold, while the world kept clapping. Today, at 84, Cliff Richard still wears the same smile, but if you look closely, something's changed. The light is softer now, the silence heavier. And when you hear what really happened to him, not in the spotlight, but in the shadows, you may never look at him the same again. Before the records, before the sold-out shows, before anyone ever screamed his name, there was a scared little boy standing barefoot in a foreign land, watching his family crumble in silence. Harry Roger Webb was born in 1940, in the fading shadow of the British Empire, in Lucknow, India. On paper, his family had structure, his father held a respectable job, they lived under colonial order. But beneath the surface, the world was already breaking apart. Tensions hung in the air at every dinner. Conversations were clipped, smiles were forced. The kind of sadness that children feel, even if they don't understand it. And then, in 1948, came the collapse. India declared independence. The British Raj was over. For millions, it was a victory. But for the Webb family, it was exile. They left behind the only life they'd ever known and arrived in post-war England, a country they technically belonged to, but which felt like a stranger. There were no servants, no courtyards, no sense of dignity, just gray skies, ration books, and the biting cold of survival. The Webbs squeezed into a tiny flat in Cheshunt, Hertfordshire. No heat, no comfort, no future in sight. Years later, Cliff would say quietly, "There were nights I watched my mother cry in silence." His father, once confident and capable, fell into quiet despair. And the boy who used to run through sun-drenched courtyards in India now curled up under threadbare blankets at night, trying to keep warm beside his siblings. From the outside, he was just another immigrant boy adjusting to life in a bleak, unfamiliar land. But inside, something had already shifted. He learned that silence was sometimes kinder than truth. That hunger wasn't just for food, it was for hope, and that the world could change overnight, whether you were ready or not. These early years didn't just shape Cliff Richard, they scarred him. And in those scars, the first spark of something bigger began to flicker. There's a specific kind of silence that falls over a home when survival becomes the only goal. It's not angry, not chaotic, it's quiet, too quiet. The kind that weighs on a child's chest long before he has the words to describe it. That was Cliff Richard's world, or rather Harry Webb's plans. After arriving in England, the dreams his parents once held dissolved into the cold post-war fog. His father, who had once been someone of stature back in India, couldn't find work. His mother, burdened with keeping the family afloat, wore her heartbreak behind tired eyes and trembling hands. "We didn't talk about it," Cliff once said, "but I saw it. I saw everything." Every day, young Harry woke up to a world that kept getting smaller. The apartment was cramped, the food was scarce, and the future felt like something meant for other people. He watched his parents shrink, not physically, but emotionally, as the pressure of making ends meet chipped away at their confidence. He learned to hide his own needs. He smiled when he was hungry, He stayed quiet when the cold bit through his skin, and when his mother cried in the kitchen, he pretended not to hear. But beneath the surface, something was stirring, something that couldn't be silenced by poverty or buried by hardship. A tiny flame, a hunger for more, not food, but freedom. And one day, that flame would catch fire, because in the middle of all that gray, music arrived. It didn't come with a parade. It didn't knock on the door and introduce itself. But the moment young Harry Webb heard American rock and roll for the first time, something in his soul cracked wide open. He didn't just hear it, he felt it. Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Buddy Holly. Their voices weren't just songs, they were liberation. For a boy boxed in by cold nights, silent dinners, and a future that felt painfully predictable, those sounds were like someone had kicked a hole in the sky. Suddenly, the world didn't feel so small. Suddenly, life didn't have to be a quiet surrender. "I wanted to be on stage," he later said. "I wanted to make people feel what they made me feel." Play. But wanting something and believing you deserve it, those are two very different things. At school, he was shy, tall, awkward, soft-spoken. He wasn't the kid people noticed. He was the kid people looked past. University wasn't an option. Factory work was. And like so many boys from broken beginnings, his future seemed already written. But music kept whispering. He started sneaking into youth clubs and church halls, anywhere with a stage, even if that stage was nothing more than a dusty corner and a mic that barely worked. One night, he borrowed his uncle's guitar. Another night, he borrowed something much harder to find: his mother's courage. At 17, he made a choice that would change everything. He became Cliff Richard. The name wasn't random. Cliff, like an unshakable edge. Richard, a tribute to Little Richard, the rebel who'd cracked his heart wide open. It wasn't a stage name. It was armor. Armor for the boy who still curled up beneath thin blankets at night, who carried the weight of a quiet family collapse on his back. He wasn't trying to be famous. He was trying to survive in a world that had almost convinced him he didn't matter. And then, he sang. In 1958, Cliff Richard stepped into a studio with his band, still called the Drifters at the time, and recorded a song that wasn't clean, wasn't polished, and certainly wasn't what the industry expected. It was raw. It was jagged. It was alive. It was called Move It. They didn't know it then, but those 2.5 minutes would change the course of British music forever. It wasn't just a debut single, it was a declaration. This wasn't America's sound echoing overseas. This was Britain finding its own voice through a boy who'd been overlooked his whole life. Move It climbed to number 2 on the UK charts. Suddenly, the shy, factory-line kid with too many siblings and not enough money was a star. But what the cameras couldn't see, what the fans didn't know, was that the boy who now filled dance halls had once filled his own silence with prayer. That he sang not from comfort, but from ache. That every note was built on memories of hunger, fear, and a quiet promise made to himself: "I will not be forgotten." And maybe that's what made Cliff Richard so magnetic. Behind the slick hair and the sharp cheekbones, there was something vulnerable. A performer who didn't just entertain, he endured. The world saw a teen idol. What they didn't see was a survivor. Cliff Richard didn't arrive in the spotlight like a prince born to shine. He arrived like a storm that had waited long enough. And the moment he took that mic, Britain listened. For many, it looked like a fairy tale. Young Cliff Richard, handsome and polished, rising faster than anyone could believe. The music was catchy, the fans were screaming, and the media crowned him Britain's golden boy. But this wasn't a Cinderella story. It was something far more complicated and far more real. Behind every television smile, there was a boy who still remembered the sound of his mother crying in the dark. Behind every perfectly timed performance, there was a young man who still winced when he thought about his father's quiet collapse. The world had handed him fame, but it hadn't erased what came before. And that's what made Cliff different. He didn't rise because he escaped his pain. He rose because he carried it with him into every song, every interview, every moment on stage. He didn't follow trends. He didn't chase fame. He wasn't built on hype. He was built on hunger, on survival, on the unshakable belief that maybe, just maybe, his voice could take him somewhere the world hadn't already shut the door. The elegance people admired in him? That was hard-won. It was learned in silence, forged in sacrifice. His charm? That was a shield, a way to keep people at just the right distance, close enough to love him, but never close enough to truly know him. By the time he was 20, Cliff Richard was already a household name. But at night, when the noise stopped and the lights dimmed, he wasn't a legend. He was still Harry Webb, the barefoot boy, who'd once stared out a window and promised himself he'd never disappear. In an era where every ambitious singer dreamed of crossing the Atlantic and taking on America, Cliff Richard didn't chase Hollywood. He didn't have to, because Britain wasn't just watching, it was clinging to him. Post-war England was a nation still rebuilding itself, still aching from the scars of conflict and loss. People needed something, someone to believe in, and Cliff became that symbol. Not because he demanded it, but because his presence offered something rare: hope without ego, joy without excess. His songs weren't just hits. They were emotional lifelines for a country trying to find its rhythm again. Living Doll, The Young Ones, Summer Holiday. These weren't just tracks on a jukebox, they were moments people built their lives around. Weddings, first loves, slow dances, tearful goodbyes. Cliff's voice was the backdrop to them all. British cinema fell in love with him too. He wasn't an actor, but he didn't need to be. He was the story, the clean-cut hero who didn't need to play a part because he already embodied everything audiences craved. Charm, talent, wholesomeness. He wasn't wild. He wasn't dangerous. And somehow, that made him even more magnetic. Cliff Richard gave the British public something more enduring than fame. He gave them stability in a world that had lost its footing. He wasn't chasing trends. He was becoming tradition. By the early 1962nd, the winds of music were shifting. The Beatles exploded onto the scene like a cultural earthquake, redefining everything from fashion to sound to what it meant to be a star. For most artists of Cliff's generation, that wave was too big, too loud, too fast. They vanished almost overnight, relics of a gentler time. But not Cliff. He didn't panic. He didn't imitate. He didn't beg to stay relevant. He simply kept going. And in 1964, at the height of Beatlemania, Cliff Richard landed more UK top 10 hits than the Beatles themselves. Even John Lennon and Paul McCartney would later credit him. Cliff opened the door we walked through, they said. That wasn't just respect. It was an admission. Before the mania, before the mop tops, before the world screamed for Ringo or George, it screamed for Cliff. And yet, he never gloated. He didn't need to. Because Cliff's power wasn't about being louder or newer. It was about being constant, the anchor in a sea of noise. Still, something was shifting inside him. Beneath the spotlights and the polished performances, Cliff began to feel a pull not toward reinvention, but toward revelation. He wasn't interested in chasing applause forever. He wanted something deeper, something the charts couldn't measure. And so, just as the world tried to rewrite the rules of fame, Cliff prepared to rewrite himself. In 1966, at the very peak of his fame, Cliff Richard did something unthinkable. He stepped away not from music entirely, but from the version of himself the world had come to expect. He had the hits, the headlines, the entire nation at his feet, but something inside him was restless. Then came a moment that changed his life forever. Cliff attended a rally led by American evangelist Billy Graham. It wasn't just a sermon, it was a lightning strike to his soul. In a world obsessed with reinvention, Cliff didn't rebrand. He converted. He publicly embraced Christianity, and in doing so, shattered the image of the suave, untouchable pop idol. It wasn't strategic. It wasn't safe. It was, in his own words, the truth I could no longer ignore. The backlash came fast and hard. Fins disappear. Record. Sales dipped. Tour dates were canceled. Industry insiders whispered that he was finished. I felt unmade, he later confessed. I didn't know who I was on stage or off. But instead of retreating, Cliff leaned in. He stopped pretending. He stopped performing a version of himself he no longer recognized. And out of that spiritual upheaval, a new voice began to emerge, one that was more raw, more human, and more honest than ever before. He didn't lose his fire. He purified it. In a world that worshipped flash, Cliff chose faith. And in doing so, he proved that real transformation isn't loud. It's sacred. The Cliff Richard who emerged from that spiritual rebirth didn't just sing differently, he felt different. And his music followed. Gone were the sugar-coated teenage love songs. In their place came something deeper, darker, more real. Miss You Nights, Devil Woman. These weren't just hits, they were confessions. They carried the ache of a man growing older in public while quietly hurting in private. Cliff wasn't trying to impress anymore. He was trying to express. There was no meltdown, no scandal, no descent into chaos like so many of his peers. Instead, he chose the harder path. Disciplina over indulgence, silence over spectacle, loyalty over limelight. He never lashed out. He never spiraled. But don't mistake that for ease. Inside, he was carrying an enormous weight, the pressure to be perfect, the fear of being misunderstood, the ache of being loved by millions but truly known by none. Behind every camera-ready smile was a man wrestling with loneliness. Behind every note was a prayer that maybe the music could say what he couldn't. He became a kind of paradox, a public figure who gave everything to his audience and yet kept the most vulnerable parts of himself sealed away. And perhaps that's why his songs in this era hit so hard. Because they weren't designed for popularity. They were designed for truth. Cliff Richard never gave the world a scandal. No messy divorces. No broken bottles. No paparazzi meltdowns. While other stars exploded under the weight of fame, Cliff chose stillness. He didn't self-destruct, he self-contained. But that came with a cost. He became a master of restraint, a living symbol of control. He didn't just carry his own expectations, he carried a nation's, a role model, a moral compass, a man who had to be better, always. So he smiled, he posed, he performed, and all the while, his silence grew heavier. He didn't rage when the tabloids mocked him. He didn't protest when the press prodded into his private life. He held his head high even when it ached with questions no one dared ask out loud. There were no messy breakdowns. But make no mistake, there were breakdowns. They just happened behind closed doors, in hotel rooms, on quiet walks, in long nights where applause faded, and the only thing left was the sound of his own breath and the echo of a life too tightly wrapped in expectations. Even when love seemed close, Cliff kept his distance. Even when loneliness crept in, he wouldn't let it break the mask. Because being Cliff Richard, the Cliff Richard meant always holding it together, even if it meant never truly letting go. From the outside, Cliff Richard's life looked effortless. He had the hits, the homes, the legacy, decades of success with barely a wrinkle in his public image. But that was the great illusion. Because Cliff didn't glide through life, he climbed, brick by brick, quietly, relentlessly, and often, painfully. He built a reputation not just with talent, but with control. He wasn't wild. He wasn't rebellious. He was careful, polished, precise. But behind that perfection was pain. He had become the man Britain wanted him to be. But in doing so, parts of Harry Webb, the boy who once slept beneath thin blankets, slowly disappeared. He never demanded sympathy. He never complained. But there were cracks in the armor. The paradox of Cliff Richard is this. He made it look easy, but it was anything but. His smile may have seemed effortless, but it was carved from years of whispered prayers, personal sacrifices, and quiet nights, wondering if there was more to life than singing to strangers and sleeping alone. Even in moments of triumph, a part of him remained unreachable, as if he'd locked away his truest self for protection, for survival, and thrown away the key. He was adored by millions, but how many really knew him? And how many ever realized that the man who gave so much joy to others often faced his own reflection with the weight of a sorrow too quiet for words. By the mid-1972nd, something unimaginable happened. Cliff Richard, the man who had been a constant voice on the radio for nearly 2 decades, suddenly went quiet. No chart-topping hits, no magazine covers, no screaming fans chasing his car down the street. The music industry had moved on, and it left Cliff behind. For the first time since he was a teenager, the applause stopped, and the silence was deafening. In his own words, he admitted, "There was a moment when I thought, maybe I've had my time, maybe the curtain's falling." That wasn't just self-doubt. It was a quiet heartbreak, the kind that doesn't shout, but settles deep in your chest like a stone. Imagine being the heartbeat of a generation, then waking up one day and realizing no one's listening. Imagine living off the energy of packed arenas and suddenly, your phone doesn't ring. For Cliff, the silence wasn't just professional. It was spiritual, emotional, a reminder that no amount of legacy can shield you from feeling forgotten. And yet, even in that darkness, Cliff didn't collapse. He didn't rage against the world or chase trends in desperation. Instead, he did what only the truly resilient can do. He waited, and when the moment was right, he reached deep not into his fame, but into his soul and prepared to rise again. In 1976, just when the world thought Cliff Richard had quietly faded into nostalgia, he struck back not with glitter or gimmicks, but with something haunting, a song called Devil Woman. It wasn't like anything he'd done before. Dark, seductive, mysterious. It sent a chill through audiences who thought they already knew him. And for the first time in his career, Cliff cracked the American market top 10 on the Billboard charts. A British icon, once boxed in by teen idol expectations, had just reinvented himself with a track that was mature, moody, and mesmerizing. But this wasn't some clever pivot. Cliff wasn't chasing a trend. He was shedding a skin. With Devil Woman, he showed the world a different side of himself, one that had lived too long in the shadows of restraint, one that was finally ready to speak in shades of gray instead of black and white. The critics had to stop and listen, not because it was fashionable, but because it was real. And suddenly, voices that had once dismissed him began to speak his name with a different tone. Respect. Musical giants Elton John, Eric Clapton acknowledged his evolution, not as nostalgia, but as renewal. Cliff hadn't returned to reclaim his youth. He had outgrown it. The man who once sang for teenage hearts now sang with the scars of a life lived fully and felt deeply. Devil Woman wasn't just a comeback. It was a warning. I'm still here, and I'm not finished yet. The late 1972nd and early 1982nd didn't just mark a comeback for Cliff Richard, they marked a reinvention. But not the flashy, attention-seeking kind. This was deeper, richer, honest. He didn't return to pop music as the fresh-faced teen idol people once screamed for. He returned as a man who had lived, who had suffered in silence, who had survived fame's cold shoulder and come back with something to say. Songs like We Don't Talk Anymore weren't just catchy radio hits. They were emotional exorcisms full of longing, quiet resentment, and the kind of heartbreak that doesn't explode, it lingers. His album, Always Guaranteed, wasn't just a success. It was a balm, a collection of songs that soothed an audience who, like him, had grown up and grown tired of empty noise. Then came Mistletoe and Wine, a holiday track that, in anyone else's hands, might have been cheesy or forgettable. But Cliff made it sacred, a seasonal anthem of comfort, tradition, and timeless warmth. And in 1989, at Wembley Stadium, he gave not just a concert, but a confession. That night, in front of tens of thousands, Cliff laid out his entire journey, not with speeches, but with melodies. It was a living memoir in song form. You could hear every high, every heartbreak, every whispered prayer between the lyrics. And as the crowd sang with him, it became clear. This wasn't a man who had simply endured the decades. He had transcended them. Then in 1990, Saviour's Day hit #1 in the UK. Not because it was trendy, but because it was true. And that truth, that purity, is what saved him. Cliff didn't storm back into the spotlight. He walked with faith, with intention, and with the kind of strength that doesn't scream, it shines quietly. For all his fame, for all the stages he lit up, and hearts he touched, Cliff Richard's most profound relationships rarely made headlines. They weren't loud. They were lived in shadows and in song. Among them, one stood apart, Olivia Newton-John. Their bond spanned over 5 decades, not defined by romance in the public eye, but by something quieter and arguably more lasting. Cliff once admitted, in the softest of voices, "I was in love with her, but she was engaged to someone else." The someone else? Bruce Welch, Cliff's own bandmate and close friend. And so, as Olivia walked down the aisle with another man, Cliff did what he always did. He stepped back, smiled, and let it go. But did he, really? Over the years, their voices would intertwine in duets that felt less like performances and more like conversations between souls who almost found each other, but never quite did. Their final duet, in 2015, wasn't just a performance. It was a farewell. And when Olivia passed in 2022, Cliff didn't release a grand tribute. He didn't give interviews or write songs. He simply whispered, "She didn't die. She just stopped living." 7 words, and a heartbreak too profound to explain. Because Olivia was more than a what-if. She was a symbol of everything Cliff had to sacrifice to protect the version of himself the world demanded. A love not lost to time, but to timing. Olivia Newton-John wasn't the only woman who might have changed the course of Cliff Richard's life, but every time love came close, it seemed to drift just out of reach. In 1961, he wrote a heart-wrenching 3-page letter to Delia Wicks, a beautiful Australian dancer he had loved deeply. In it, Cliff confessed something most stars would never admit. Being a pop singer, I have to give up one priceless thing, the right to any lasting relationship with any special girl. And that wasn't a breakup letter. It was a personal crucifixion, a decision to surrender a lifetime of love in exchange for a career that demanded solitude. Then came Jackie Irving, radiant, captivating, full of warmth. For a brief moment, it seemed like she might be the one to break the pattern. But again, the stage won. Jackie married another man, and Cliff was left holding yet another memory of what could have been, but wasn't. And in the 1982nd, the world watched with curiosity as he grew close to tennis champion Sue Barker. Photos showed them laughing, holding hands, smiling in ways that looked almost like forever. Cliff even said, "If marriage comes on the horizon, I shall relish it." But in time, he quietly admitted, "I didn't love her quite enough to commit the rest of my life." Sue, with grace and poise, responded, "We love each other, and we still do." It was a melody Cliff knew all too well, a song of almost, of might-have-beens, of connections that slipped through his fingers just as they started to feel real. The public never saw him cry, never saw him beg or break. But the truth is, while Cliff gave everything to his audience, he never allowed himself to give everything to another person. And that kind of sacrifice, it leaves a shadow no spotlight can chase away. Cliff Richard's love life wasn't a tabloid spectacle. There were no bitter exes, no scandalous confessions, no dramatic headlines. But that doesn't mean there wasn't heartbreak. In fact, it may have been even more tragic, because it was so quiet. The women he loved weren't chased away by bad behavior, they were edged out by devotion. Devotion to a life on stage, to his faith, to a version of himself that had to remain untouchable. The result? A lifetime of almosts. Hands held, but not kept. Affection felt, but not spoken. Love observed, but never fully claimed. And when the world began to speculate, questioning why he never married, never had children, never settled down, Cliff didn't lash out. He didn't offer clarity. He offered a boundary. Once, when asked about the rumors surrounding his sexuality, Cliff responded with the kind of grace only a man truly at peace could muster. "If I was, would it matter?" And with that, He silenced decades of curiosity, not with denial, not with shame, but with truth. His identity was never a performance. It wasn't for sale, and it wasn't owed to the public. Cliff Richard chose dignity over disclosure. While others confessed or collapsed under scrutiny, he built quiet walls, not to hide, but to protect the parts of himself the world didn't deserve to touch. And in doing so, he taught us something rare, that the most sacred kind of love might just be the kind the world never sees. In 2001, Cliff Richard quietly welcomed someone into his life, not with fanfare, not with press releases, but with a steady kind of presence that grew over time. John Macallan, a former American missionary turned close companion. John wasn't part of Cliff's public brand, but he became a central figure in his private world. They traveled together, worked side by side, shared dinners, silence, and faith. John helped manage Cliff's homes, toured with him, and perhaps most importantly stood with him through years the public would never understand. To some, their closeness raised questions. But Cliff never played that game. He didn't explain. He didn't deny. He simply lived his truth quietly and with grace. When asked about their bond, Cliff didn't offer gossip. He offered something far more profound. It's nice to have someone who cares about you, not because you're famous, but just because you're you. That wasn't a headline. That was a sanctuary. A reminder that chosen family can heal wounds even fame can't touch. In a world that demanded exposure, Cliff protected the sacred. He didn't owe anyone an answer, and that in itself became a quiet form of rebellion. Because love, real love, doesn't need a label. It just needs loyalty. For decades, Cliff Richard had done everything right. He avoided scandal. He stayed grounded. He offered nothing but grace to a world that often took more than it gave. But in August 2014, all of that shattered, not because of something he did, but because of something he didn't. There was no warning, no knock at the door, just the sudden roar of helicopter blades slicing through the summer air above his Berkshire home. BBC cameras circled overhead as police raided his house live, in real time in connection with an anonymous allegation. No charges had been filed. No accuser had stepped forward. No evidence had been shown. But Cliff Richard, the knighted icon, the man who had brought joy to millions, was thrust into a media firestorm built on whispers. What followed was a nightmare, not just of suspicion, but of betrayal. This wasn't just an invasion of privacy. It was a public crucifixion without a trial. For 22 long months, Cliff lived in a state of limbo, his name smeared, his soul bruised, his life paused. He couldn't sleep. He lost weight. Stress triggered a painful outbreak of shingles. I was unraveling, he later admitted. They stole my joy. And the cruelest part? It wasn't just the accusation, it was how it was handled. The BBC, once a symbol of trust in his life, had worked hand in hand with police to film the raid before he even knew what he was being accused of. It wasn't justice. It was spectacle. And the damage was done long before any truth could surface. The investigation dragged on, month after painful month. No one came forward. No charges were filed. But the damage to Cliff Richard's soul and his sense of safety was already done. Behind the scenes, friends said he wasn't the same. He avoided mirrors. He avoided people. He even considered selling all his homes and leaving the UK, the very country that once worshipped him. There were times I didn't want to live here anymore, he admitted, voice trembling. The weight of public suspicion when tied to no crime is a quiet kind of torture. And yet, Cliff Richard refused to stay silent. In 2018, after the case was finally dropped, Cliff did something few expected. He fought back. He filed a lawsuit against the BBC. Not for money, but for something far more sacred, his dignity. And he won. A landmark ruling declared that the BBC had violated his rights by broadcasting the police raid. He was awarded over £2 million in damages. But the real victory? He reclaimed his humanity, his voice, his right to not be trialed by media. This is not just about me, Cliff said afterward. It's about protecting everyone from being destroyed by assumption. And Even after vindication, the scars remain. He spoke of sleepless nights, of joy stolen, of how fragile even the strongest man can feel when truth becomes irrelevant. But through it all, Cliff stood tall not with rage, but with resolve. He didn't scream, he spoke, and when he spoke, the world finally listened. Today, in his mid-82nd, Sir Cliff Richard lives between worlds, not quite retired, not quite in the spotlight, but still unmistakably present. He splits his time between two places: a sun-kissed villa in Barbados, nestled in the private community of Sugar Hill, and a peaceful countryside estate in Portugal, surrounded by vineyards and silence. His Barbados home Coral Sundown once rented for $3,000 a night. 6 bedrooms, a private tennis court, ocean breeze drifting through white curtains. But to Cliff, it isn't luxury. It's shelter, a place where he can finally exhale. In Portugal, the estate known as Quinta do Moinho sprawls across 30 acres. It was once on the market for $7 million, but Cliff never let go. It holds too many memories. Over time, he's quietly downsized, even letting go of his beloved home in England's elite St. George's Hill. It wasn't about money. It was about peace. Despite a net worth estimated between $90, $100 million, Cliff has never chased extravagance. His car collection is modest by celebrity standards: a Bentley, a Mercedes, a Mazda. Elegant, not loud. Comfortable, not flashy. But even surrounded by beauty, friends say there's still a silence in his life that no applause can fill. A space once reserved for love, for family, for something ordinary. Because while Cliff Richard has built a life of incredible serenity, long walks through vineyards, herbal tea at dawn, classical music in the background, there's also a kind of ache that lingers. It lives in the way he moves slower now, in the way he pauses during interviews, in the softness behind his smile. He never says it, but you can feel it. He chose this life, but that doesn't mean it hasn't cost him something precious. At 84, Cliff Richard still rises with the sun, not to rehearse for a show, or chase headlines, or plan a new comeback. He gets up because motion has always been his medicine. He walks the vineyard trails behind his Portugal estate. He stretches on the veranda, the warm Mediterranean breeze brushing against his silver hair. He sips herbal tea, no coffee, no alcohol, nothing that disrupts his rhythm. His body is thinner now, his steps slower. There's a gentleness in how he carries himself, like he's conserving energy, not just physically, but emotionally. But don't mistake that for frailty, because beneath the quiet, Cliff is still Cliff. In 2023, he released a new orchestral album, Cliff with Strings, My Kind of Life. It climbed into the UK's top 5. And in 2025, just months before turning 85, he launched the Can't Stop Me Now tour. A title that wasn't just clever branding. It was a declaration. He performed across the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, not to prove anything, but to celebrate something: longevity with purpose. When asked the secret to his energy, he didn't talk about diets or gyms. He said simply, "I just keep moving." That's always been the truth of Cliff Richard. He moves, even when it hurts, even when it's slow, even when the world gives him every reason to stop. Because forward, however gently, is the only direction he's ever known. For all his success, Cliff Richard has never built a traditional family. No wife, no children, no next generation to carry his name. And still, his legacy may be more powerful than any bloodline, because what he's chosen to leave behind isn't tied to inheritance. It's tied to impact. Though the contents of his will remain private, those close to him believe the majority of his wealth will go not to individuals, but to the causes that shaped his life. For decades, the Sir Cliff Richard Charitable Trust has quietly supported over 50 UK charities every single quarter. Children's hospices, cancer foundations, elder care, Alzheimer's research, medical support for the forgotten and voiceless. He's also a patron of Guitar Aid, donating signed instruments to missions around the globe, ensuring that music reaches corners of the world that money can't. And Cliff's generosity isn't performative. It started in the 1962nd, when he made a private vow to tithe 10% of his income. Not once, but for life. More than half a century later, he still honors that promise. In an industry built on ego and excess, Cliff chose something else. Conviction. He didn't just want to be remembered as a star. He wanted to be remembered as a servant. Someone who didn't just sing about hope, but funded it, lived it, gave it away. Because Cliff Richard's life has never been about keeping. It's always been about giving. Cliff Richard didn't grow old in the way most celebrities do. There were no desperate reinventions, no chasing youth, no clinging to relevance. Instead, he aged intentionally with grace, gratitude, and quiet resolve. While others broadcasted their retirements or plotted comebacks soaked in nostalgia, Cliff simply kept living, and not just living, thriving, on his own terms. No dramatic farewell tours, no one last album hype, just a steady rhythm of creation, reflection, and generosity. His life today isn't a quiet retirement. It's a living philosophy, a testament that aging doesn't have to mean fading, that you can get slower and still grow stronger. His skin, still tanned from years in the island sun, carries the softness of a man who stopped needing to prove anything. His hair, now trimmed and silver, suits the simplicity he's embraced. He doesn't hide from the mirror. He meets it with calm, and when he speaks, it's not with urgency but with weight. The kind that only comes from having walked through fire and come out refined. Cliff Richard has become something rare, an artist who aged with purpose, not regret. A man who proved that discipline, faith, and kindness aren't just survival tools, they're sacred strategies for a life well lived. He doesn't call it wisdom, he just calls it clarity. Cliff Richard's story didn't begin with fame. It began with hunger, with a barefoot boy in post-colonial displacement, with a mother who wept in silence, with a child who learned that smiling through pain was sometimes the only option, and it never really became about fame, either. Yes, he sold more than 260 million records. Yes, he had 14 UK #1 singles and a fan base that spanned generations. But the true measure of his life isn't in the stats. It's in the things he never said, the tears he never let fall in public, the dreams he surrendered to protect his values, and the nights he chose stillness over spectacle. He didn't chase the spotlight, it chased him. And when it burned too hot, he didn't run. He endured. He adapted. And eventually, he transcended it. His impact isn't just musical. It's spiritual, moral, human. He taught us that you can be brilliant without being brash, faithful without being self-righteous, wounded without becoming bitter, and alone without being broken. His greatest hits weren't just melodies, they were mirrors, reflecting the quiet courage of a man who spent a lifetime balancing fame with faith. And through it all, Cliff never stopped singing, not because he needed to be heard, but because, deep down, he knew. Sometimes, music is the only way to tell the truth without having to explain it. Cliff Richard's legacy is extraordinary, but it's not without cost. While others built families, he built foundations. While others filled homes with children and chaos, he filled journals with lyrics and kept his house quiet. That was his choice, and it was noble. But even the noblest choices leave shadows. In interviews, he never speaks of regret, not directly. But listen closely, in the pauses between his words, in the soft smiles that linger just a second too long, in the flicker of something unspoken behind his eyes. It's there, the realization that in order to protect the Cliff Richard the world adored, Harry Webb, the boy behind the name, had to remain in hiding. He gave his fans consistency. He gave the world inspiration. But what did he keep for himself? No wedding albums, no children to call late at night, no one to hold his hand in the quiet moments between applause. Yes, he has wealth. Yes, he has peace. But peace can be lonely too. The silence that surrounds him now isn't just serenity. It's also the echo of a life lived in service to something bigger than himself, and yet never fully shared. Some stars burn out. Cliff chose to dim gently, and in that soft, fading light, you realize he didn't just give us music, he gave us himself. As Cliff Richard enters the twilight of his life, there is no grand farewell tour, no viral send-off, no dramatic announcement. Because Cliff has never needed noise to make a point. His greatest moments didn't come from shouting. They came from standing still in a world obsessed with movement. From the barefoot child in India, to the boy curled beneath threadbare blankets, to the pop icon who refused to let fame define his soul. He's lived through wars of sound and silence, and chose to build, not break. What he leaves behind isn't just a catalog of timeless hits, it's something more rare. A blueprint for how to grow older without becoming bitter, for how to live by conviction without apology, for how to love even if only in silence, and for how to walk away from a stage without ever leaving the hearts that filled it. He remains one of Britain's most successful artists of all time. But you don't remember Cliff Richard because of chart positions. You remember him because, somehow, his music sounded like home. Because in a world of noise, he gave us quiet. In a culture of oversharing, he gave us mystery. And in an age that glorifies spectacle, he gave us substance. So as we look back at his extraordinary journey, maybe the question isn't, what happened to Cliff Richard at 84? Maybe it's, what happens to us when we realize we've been listening to someone who never asked to be famous only to be faithful? That is the kind of legacy that doesn't need to be declared. It just lasts.